Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin. More specifically, we're going to be discussing the Bitcoin dominance. Of course, we will talk about how Bitcoin USD relates to that, as well as the altcoin market. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We have thousands of different charts for all sorts of different cryptocurrencies, equities, macro as well. So make sure you guys check that out. Link is in the description below. This feature-length film will be going through many different ideas, okay? And what I want to do is I want to go through all of them systematically, talk about likely outcomes, different paths, and so on and so forth. Now, the first thing I will say is that, as always, the main questions that come up with Bitcoin dominance is how can I use it to make money, right? How can I use it to make money? And it is a fair question if you are new to the crypto space, right? If you're new to the Cryptoverse and you've only been here for a year, even if you joined in 2021, and you haven't seen a full cycle of Bitcoin dominance take place, it might not necessarily be obvious why Bitcoin dominance is important. But the reason why Bitcoin dominance is important is because my goal over a long period of time is to preserve the Satoshi valuation of my portfolio. And a lot of people will go out and speculate on the altcoin market, and I think that's fine. And I do it, I will do that as well. I speculate on alts at various phases of the cycle as well. But the point at the end of the day is to preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. There's a lot of people that will compare, make the comparison of, say, Bitcoin to like MySpace or AOL, implying that it will sort of go the same way and be overtaken by other cryptocurrencies. I don't think that's true. Bitcoin has been number one in the space the entire time. It has not relinquished that number one spot, and I don't think it's going to relinquish that number one spot. If Bitcoin did not exist, then these other cryptocurrencies would not be along for the ride. So with that in mind, it's important to understand long-term trends in Bitcoin dominance. Now, the crazy thing about the dominance is because of the way the market moves, it feels like over the last 2 years, like it's always felt for a lot of people that the dominance is not going up. But then when you zoom out and you're like, well, it has been going up a lot. And it's just that what happens is after we get large moves up that happen fairly aggressively, you then consolidate for a while, and then people get bearish on it and say, well, the dominance view, should be different. But look, up, consolidate, up, consolidate, right? We just keep doing the same thing. Sometimes we get pretty large pullbacks and longer consolidation periods. But the overall trend by Bitcoin dominance has been very clear for a very long period of time. In fact, Bitcoin dominance started turning up before Bitcoin USD did, right? If you include stables, dominance bottomed in September of 2022. If you exclude stablecoins, it actually bottomed in May of 2021. That would be this chart over here. This is an approximation of it. We, of course, also have it on the Into the Cryptoverse website as well. But if you look at it excluding stables, it actually bottomed over here in May of 2021. So it's important, right? It's important to recognize that this has been a long-term trend that's been taking place for years. And for a long time, people have not believed in the Bitcoin dominance rally. They just have refused to believe it. And they sort of chase these altcoins. And what I have found over the last 2 years is that the people that used to be bearish on Bitcoin dominance, they don't talk about it as much anymore. They focus on the altcoins. But again, if you were bullish on alts a year ago, but bearish on Bitcoin dominance, then you're right, but for the wrong reasons, right? The only reason that these altcoins have a lot of them, the only main reason that they've gone up is because Bitcoin went up, right? And we know that because the dominance has gone up so much. If, on the other hand, if Bitcoin were sitting at 53K like it is, and dominance were at, say, 40%, then that would be a completely different story. That would imply that, the altcoin market is carrying the space, but that's simply not true, right? The Bitcoin dominance has been going up the entire time. And this is something we've been talking about forever. I mean, here's a video from, this is back when the dominance was at 40.6% and talking about, if you exclude stable coins, we're putting in higher lows. By the way, if we go check in on this chart, if you go check in on that chart right there, and we take a look at dominance here, and we're going to exclude stables, you can see what it's done, right? I mean, again, going back to the chart, this was back when it was, maybe about 45, 46 or so, 45, 46%. Now you go check on it today, it's at 56%, right? It's come all the way off of these levels over here, and it's way up here now, right? So it's gone up 10% since that video. And this was a video back when I was very vocal about, like, guys, these are higher lows by dominance. And you have to respect that it is putting in higher lows, whether you want to believe it or not. And now the dominance is up another 10% from that level, right? From that level. And then we did another video not too long later saying, hey, look, it's probably going to fall back into September of 2022, bottom out in September of 2022, and then turn the corner. And if you go look at Bitcoin dominance, just go take a look at where it bottomed out, right? Bottomed out right there in September. This is the Fibonacci candles. So this same chart that we were looking at down into September, turned the corner, and then Bitcoin dominance should go on a massive bull run, theoretically, to around that 60% level. And then when you look back on it, you can see that, yeah, I mean, it turned the corner in September, right? That was where it turned the corner, moved back up, put in a higher low, and has been going up ever since. So that has played out as well. And we continue on, right? Here's a video that we did back in March of 2022, or sorry, March of 2023. Dominance was at 48.6%. One shining moment in honor of the March Madness stuff. And, this was back when it was fighting to get back above that level. Now, if you go check in with that, we'll see what actually happened. And it might not be what you think. What actually happened going into that, if we draw the line across the screen, what actually happened when we did that video is that we got rejected at the range high in the short term, right? And so looking at it here, this was in, going up into March and in April, and we got rejected. And at the time, I had so many people dunking on me about the dominance view, right? So many people. And it was very frustrating because it's like, well, these are the same guys that were bearish on it over here, and now they're dunking on me because it has gotten rejected by the range high. And they were calling for alt season because dominance was going to get rejected. It didn't get rejected, right? So that should be a clear indication that there's been a shift, right? A lot of people shifted from being bearish on Bitcoin dominance to then no longer talking about it because it kept on breaking the milestones that they said it would never break. And so, yes, it is true that that video, One Shining Moment, Bitcoin Dominance One Shining Moment, was put out, and we saw a rejection. Still, a few weeks later, we broke through. And then following that, right, following that video, we did it, because a lot of times people say, well, you only make dominance videos when it's going up. What about this video, right? We made this video when dominance had pulled back to 49%, right? So the dominance had rallied up to 52%. It then came back down to 49%, where yet again, everyone was dunking on the Bitcoin dominance view. And what happened? We said, look, it'll probably hold support at the breakout point, which also happens to correspond to the bull market support band, right? This was when it was at 49%. And you go take a look at it, and that's what happened, right? I mean, it came back in, it held support at 49% and moved up aggressively over the next several months. And so we go back to this idea where there's so many people that keep saying that Bitcoin dominance has topped, but they will say it every step of the way, right? Every step of the way, that's what they're going to say. Because how can you say, it's hard for, I think, a lot of people to shift gears on it, because if they were bearish on it over here, and if they were bearish on it right here and bearish on it right here, right? I mean, at some point, they'll be right? And it'll top out. But it's important to recognize what would actually make the dominance top out. And there's a lot of people that think it has already topped out. I don't really think those people are any different than the people that thought it topped out back in the summer of 2023, but they're still there. And so in this video, I want to show why I think dominance can continue the rally, right? I think it can continue to rally. And by the way, I fully expect all the same comments on Twitter or X, dunking on these views once again. But for my own sanity, I do, it's important to go back and look at every one of these prior moves by dominance, where every time, at 40%, at 41%, at 48%, at 49%, right? Every step of the way, people have faded the Bitcoin dominance rally, okay? And so in this video, I will show why I think it will continue to climb, right? Why dominance will, in my opinion, why I think it will continue to climb. I also wanted to make a video when it's not pushing to new highs, right? Like we're only at 52 to 53%, right? 52.74%. We're not at new highs. We're still pretty far away from new highs for at least this cycle. But I think it is certainly possible that dominance could break above that 55% threshold. It's just been a very long journey, and it's taken certainly a lot longer than I thought it would, but it is still taking place. So the first thing I would like to do is to go check in with a lot of different metrics. So the first thing is we will check in with total assets held by the Federal Reserve. Okay, so if you look at that, and let me actually shift that to a new scale. If you look at that, we can pretty clearly see that last cycle, dominance did not even top until the Fed stopped reducing the size of their balance sheet. Now, could it be a coincidence? It's possible, right? It's only one data point. It's only one. It's not like we can definitively say that it will play out in a similar manner. But be that as it may, looking at this view and saying, all right, what if we just stayed bullish on dominance until the Fed pivots? Would that have been a good strategy? Yeah, I think so. I mean, imagine if over here you just said, all right, liquidity is going to start going down. Bullish on dominance until the Fed pivots. Dominance has been going up, right? So yeah, it's only a single data point. I'm not asking you to take it to the bank. They won't cash it in, I can guarantee you that. But the point is that so far, had you held that view of dominance higher until we go back to QE, you wouldn't have been wrong. Yes, you could say, well, what if dominance is already topped? That's potential, but I still will make the case why I think it will continue to go higher. If you read the recent, the recent FOMC minutes, while they have suggested they will eventually slow the pace of QT down, they haven't really outright said they're going to stop it anytime soon. So if they're not planning on stopping it in March, April, May, June, if they're not planning on stopping it for a long time, I don't see a compelling reason to change my view on Bitcoin dominance. The other thing that you can look at are interest rates. If you look at interest rates, we will see that dominance did not even top out until after the first Fed cut. So why would I assume that dominance tops out this cycle before rate cuts and before the shift to QE? I don't assume it, right? I assume that dominance will continue to go up so long as we haven't gone back to lower rates and so long as we haven't shifted away from QT, quantitative tightening, to QE, where the Fed starts to expand the balance sheet. We have not seen either of those things happen yet. And last cycle, we had to have seen those things before the dominance even topped out. And by the way, even after all that happened, we still had another rally later on where the dominance swept the high. That is not what I'm referring to in this video. I'm not referring to that sort of a move. I think we are about to enter into this move. That move, I think, will come a lot later. But that is where I think we are, and I think we are slowly building out a base to see the dominance go ultimately much higher. And one of the things that's really interesting is if you look at what dominance was doing as those first rate cuts slowly started to arrive, or started to be priced in, dominance was actually putting in lower highs, right? And I know a lot of people have been pointing that to right here, right? Like dominance keeps on putting in lower highs. And that's true, right? Like it's true. But you'll notice that you had a high, a lower high, and a lower high. And then on the fourth attempt, the dominance finally broke through, right? We've already had 1 attempt, 2 attempts, 3 attempts. I'm under the impression that on the next attempt by dominance, I think it could very well break through. That doesn't mean it has to happen tomorrow. It's possible that it comes all the way back down into the 51 range before going back up. I don't know. But the point is that this exact trend happened last cycle just before the Fed started to cut interest rates. And you can see that dominance finally broke through that level 3 months before the first rate cut arrived. So I think that this is ultimately what's about to happen, is that dominance will soar right before the first rate cut arrives. And again, here, dominance started to soar in April of 2019, and it did not stop until September. Now, it's almost March, right? It's almost March. And it's possible, again, that dominance is not breaking this trend line just yet, right? It's possible that it could go into another period where it slowly bleeds. But regardless, even if it does that, I still think it will ultimately break out to the upside, right? So either it breaks out here and goes up, or it could come back in to that 51.5% level and then break up. In fact, if you look at dominance on a longer sort of trend line, right? If we look at it on this trend line right here, what you'll see is that it hasn't, it really has just continued this series of higher lows. And on shorter time frames, if you take it from like right here, it almost looks like we're in an ascending triangle right now, right? It sort of looks like we're in an ascending triangle where first dominance held support at 49%, and then it held support at 51%. And it's trying to break above that 54% threshold, but has been unable to do so yet. And so, if it falls in here, as long as it's not coming back into like the 49% level, I still think the dominance trend remains intact, and I think ultimately it will build up to this level here and break up. That is my view on the Bitcoin dominance, and I think that's ultimately where it is headed. Inevitably, anytime these videos come out, tons of people dunk on them. Tons of people do it. But again, if you go look at what any of them were saying a year ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago about Bitcoin dominance, they were bearish on it every step of the way, right? So yes, it's easy to do it. It's easy to dunk on the dominance. And the reason why I think a lot of people dunk on it, and the reason why I won't stop talking about it, but I think the reason people dunk on it is because they want to see their altcoins durably outperform it. And the thing is, some of them do, right? Some altcoins do outperform Bitcoin, even in a Bitcoin dominance rally. But what's more important over what will we really focus on, right? Are we going to focus on the few altcoins that have durably outperformed Bitcoin, or do we focus on the fact that the trend by Bitcoin dominance has been up for 2 years? Yes, some altcoins have outperformed. One of the issues with the altcoins that outperformed is it tends to rotate which ones are actually outperforming, right? So the ones that are outperforming it this year are often not the ones that were outperforming it last year. And we've actually seen that happen many, many times. For instance, let's go through a few examples and better understand why preserving the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio is important. So Matic Bitcoin, right? Look at Matic Bitcoin. If you go back a year ago, right? If you look at like say 2022 and early 2023, Matic Bitcoin was outperforming. But look what it's doing now. It's doing not a lot of anything, right? If you were to look at Matic USD, this was a fairly impressive rally. This one hasn't been as impressive, especially considering that Bitcoin is you know, I mean, it's back near its highs and Matic is nowhere near its highs, right? So yes, Matic USD went up a lot over here. Everyone was, you know, super bullish on it, but it faded all the way back down near the range lows and it still hasn't really gone anywhere. So Matic was one that did really well back over here against Bitcoin, but now it's not, right? And again, that can be viewed better on the Matic Bitcoin chart. Over here, Matic Bitcoin was doing really well. Over here, not so much, right? So the point is that by holding Matic over Bitcoin, you haven't been preserving the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio anytime recently, right? Anyone who's been buying it all the way down, I mean, they just would have been better off buying Bitcoin. Now, look at another example. Look at some of these coins that have done really well this year, right? Like Avalanche has done pretty well this year, and it's been doing a lot better this year than it did last year, right? So like last year, in that same window where Matic was doing well, Avalanche wasn't really doing much of anything. Now this year, and late 2023, Avalanche has been doing a lot, but it didn't do that same over here. And then if you go look at the AVAX Bitcoin valuation, what do you notice? You notice that it still hasn't really durably changed the trend, right? I mean, this has been a fairly impressive move by Avalanche, don't get me wrong, and I hope that it ultimately survives. But the point is that it has still bled against Bitcoin over a long enough period of time. Yes, if you cherry pick this level here, it's up, but the issue is that at the current valuations of AVAX Bitcoin, you know, unless you YOLO'd everything in right here, you're still not doing that well, right? You're still, you know, looking at this entire move that has not been recaptured. And so you can kind of go through the list and see how some of the ones that are doing well against Bitcoin this year are the ones that were not doing well against Bitcoin last year, and vice versa. So what happens is that people end up chasing, right? They chase an altcoin because it's doing well against Bitcoin. Like Matic, they chase it because it was doing well against Bitcoin, and then it just bleeds, right? So people trade in their alts for one that's doing well. That marks the top for that alt, and then the ones they left, you know, maybe they get a turn eventually. And so what happens is these altcoins, you know, one goes up against Bitcoin, everyone say dunks on the Bitcoin dominance views that I have, and then next year they're just dunking on the dominance views, but for a different altcoin, right? And so it's just chasing one new shiny object after another, but in the entire time, the dominance of Bitcoin was going up. So the reason why dominance is important is because it helps to preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. So that if you want exposure to crypto and you just have a Bitcoin heavy portfolio, it gives you exposure to the upside while minimizing your downside risk, right? So that's why for the last couple of years, my crypto portfolio has just been Bitcoin heavy, because I've been under the assumption that dominance of Bitcoin is going to go up. I don't really care that much if an altcoin pumps here or there. I'd rather preserve the Satoshi valuation of my portfolio. And that is exactly what I've done, right? Being Bitcoin heavy has helped preserve it, because if I had gone with any of these altcoins, most of them are down against Bitcoin. Now, I think sometimes it's a little abstract for people to understand, because we're looking at like Satoshi valuations of these altcoins, like ADA Bitcoin, you're looking at like the Satoshi valuation of it. So it's kind of hard to understand like what it even means. What's a really useful exercise is to say, take the inverse of it and pretty clearly see how like today, one Bitcoin would fetch you 88,000 ADA, you know, in a year ago. So if we were to go to February of 2023, one Bitcoin would fetch you 57,000 ADA, right? A year before that, February, one Bitcoin would have fetched you 36,000 ADA. So do you see the trend, right? So let's look at it. February 2022, right there, 38,000 ADA. February 2023, 60,000 ADA or so. Today, 80,000. So what is the trend, right? What is the trend? It's going up, right? But this is the inverse ADA Bitcoin, meaning Bitcoin has been outperforming ADA. So that's how you preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio, by being Bitcoin heavy, right? Because yes, there's going to be some altcoins you miss out on, but having it allows you to at least preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. And I'm not saying you can't speculate on alts. It's just that you have to understand that given over a long enough period of time, a lot of these altcoins end up bleeding back to Bitcoin, especially during a tightening cycle. And so this has been a pretty clear trend. It's not just that. I mean, look at Matic, and let's look at 1/over Matic Bitcoin. You know, this is one of those ones that February 2023, one Bitcoin would have fetched you about 16,000 Matic. Today, it gets you about 52,000 Matic. All you had to do is stick with Bitcoin. AVAX Bitcoin, take the inverse. February 2022, one Bitcoin got you 500 AVAX. February 2023, one Bitcoin got you around 1,300. That's about where it is today. But still, you know, what ends up happening, and what's very frustrating for me, is that you occasionally get these larger moves up, and then everyone measures the performance from that level there, disregarding the fact that most people were you know, DCAing into it over there against Bitcoin, and completely losing the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio. Dot Bitcoin, another great example of all this, right? Look at 1/over Dot Bitcoin. Where was it in February of 2022, right? One Bitcoin got you 2,000 dot. February 2023, one Bitcoin got you 3,500 dot. February 2024, one Bitcoin gets you 6,700 dot. Has buying Polkadot been lucrative? You might say, well, it's at $8. So if you bet the family farm on it right here at $3 or $4, hey, you're up 2x. Congratulations, right? Congratulations, you're up 2x. The problem, right? The problem is that Dot Bitcoin has been going down. So you took on more risk, and you're still down 85% against Bitcoin. So yes, I mean, congratulations for being up 2x if you bought the lows. And I mean that sincerely, right? Like, you took on a risk and it paid off. The problem is that it still has just been bleeding back to Bitcoin over a long enough period of time. And I think, you know, everyone wants to keep front running where the dominance tops, right? They keep trying to front run it and say, all right, well, now it's going to top. You know, it's going to top at 45% or 49 or 53 or 55, whatever. They want to front run it because no one wants to miss out on this alt season, this nebulous alt season where altcoins durably outperform Bitcoin. But the problem, as I specified earlier with that view, is that it implies that the dominance rally is over. It implies that retail is coming back in mass. And there's two issues with that. Issue number one is that during the 2019 Bitcoin dominance rally, retail did not come back in mass. And dominance continued to go up until the Fed pivoted. Second thing is there's no guarantee about what the future holds, right? All we know right now is that the dominance has been in an uptrend for a long time, and momentum is a hell of a thing, and it's hard to fade that, right? I mean, yes, it's possible that the dominance rally doesn't extend as high as I think, but at the same time, I still think it's a win for anyone who's been following the Bitcoin dominance rally, because it has helped you to preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. Now, we have to talk about ETH Bitcoin because I've been getting a lot of messages about this. ETH Bitcoin has had a fairly remarkable rally over the last couple of weeks. But I said previously that after testing these levels down here, right, after testing these levels, what often happens is that ETH Bitcoin bounces for a few months, right? And so back in January, when we were unable to durably go below 0.049 on the weekly, once we got that long wick down and a move, you know, started to see that move higher, I said, look, at the earliest, it'll be March before ETH Bitcoin bleeds back down. At the earliest, right? Likely March. And March even could be pushing that timeline. Still possible it happens in March, but it didn't happen in January, it didn't happen in February. And what's fascinating is if you look at 2019, it's almost lining up, right? I mean, you had a low. This low was December. This low here was January. It then popped up over here, put in a high, came back down to below the bull market support band, and then got another rally up and put in a lower high. Same thing, right? A high and then a low. We'll see where it ends up, if it's a lower high or if it ends up being different. But this move also occurred during the same time, right? It occurred in mid to late February in 2019. It's occurring in mid to late February of 2024. So again, I know people are going to say this time is different and we're at a different point in the cycle. But the issue with ETH Bitcoin, right? The issue is that it's doing what it's always done, where it fades back into these lows, bounces around a little bit, but ultimately, I think it will break down, right? Given enough time, I do think it will break down. And so what I would be looking for ETH Bitcoin is for it to slowly fade back down to the range lows sometime later on in the first half of this year, right? I do think it will likely revisit these lows at in the first half of the year. So sometime in the next 4 months, I think we'll see it back below 0.05, just like we saw it do it over here, and just like we saw it do that same thing right there. So that is my guess, and I want to take a few moments to discuss ETH Bitcoin and then talk about how that might relate to Bitcoin USD. All right. Again, guys, these views are not popular. I don't make the dominance videos because they're popular. If anything, they make me even more hated, and it's kind of difficult to deal with it, to be completely honest. But it hasn't been wrong, and I've seen this with ETH Bitcoin forever now, where it keeps on dropping and it keeps on putting in these lower highs, and every single time it gets a rally, everyone gets all up in arms about, hey, well, you were wrong about it. But this was just a massive distribution phase up here that a lot of people didn't want to believe in, right? And it's faded all the way back down to these lows that a lot of people said it would never go back to, and I find it frustrating because there's so many people that basically say, well, it'll never go back down to the June low back over here. It does it, puts in a lower low. They stay permabulls on it because that's what they're always going to do. It gets a bounce, and then they say they were right. No, they were calling for the flippening over here, right? You can't call for the flippening back in 2022 and then declare victory after it takes out the June 2022 low, which they said it was never going to take out. So that's sort of an issue, right? That a lot of people, they fall into that trap where it's playing out the way it always has. If you look at the Fib retracement on this, you can see that ETH Bitcoin actually rallied all the way back up to between the 786 and the 1 on the secondary distribution phase, which is funny because it meant that it went above that first peak, but below the second peak. But it rallied to somewhere between the 786 and the 1 Fib retracement. And then eventually it came all the way back down to these lows over here. Do you guys remember what it was like in September of 2022? I mean, I know a lot of people just look at the chart and say, oh, well, it was obvious. It was not obvious to a lot of people. I mean, everyone was talking about the flippening, and every single step of the way, people were laughing at the ETH, my views on ETH Bitcoin on every single rally. But guess what? They've all, at least so far, they've all been faded. And so what happens is basically, they turn their attention to the other spectrum, and that's the USD valuation of Ethereum, because, I ultimately think it will get a fairly large correction after ETH Bitcoin breaks down, right? So if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, there's this idea that after ETH Bitcoin drops below those lows, that's where you get a larger correction by ETH USD. So if you were to overlay ETH USD onto that chart, and let's switch this to a log scale, right? So after ETH Bitcoin broke the range low, right, you can see that ETH USD, sorry, it's the wrong percentage, right? But you can see that ETH USD got about a 50% drop. Same thing right here, right? After ETH Bitcoin broke the range low, ETH/USD topped out and had a pretty large correction. And so my view remains the same, that after ETH Bitcoin breaks the range low, ETH/USD will likely get a fairly large correction. The issue with that view is that, there's a lot of people who say, all right, well, that means there's going to be a correction every single day that ETH/USD goes up. It's frustrating for people because it hasn't seen that move. But again, the view is that that major correction can come after ETH Bitcoin breaks down below 0.049. That hasn't happened yet, right? Below 0.049, I think you're going to get a larger correction by ETH/USD as ETH Bitcoin goes back to the 0.03 to 0.04 range. But it's just taking a very long period of time for that process to play out. What's funny is that even though it is taking a very long time for it to play out, it actually hasn't taken necessarily any longer than it took last cycle, right? If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, if you were to look at ETH Bitcoin monthly candles from the secondary peak until we finally broke the range low, it took about 17 months. From that peak there to the current month, we're currently at 17 months, right? It hasn't even taken, at this point, any longer. It certainly likely will, right? Like, it's probably not, there's only a couple days left in February. So yeah, more than likely it's not going to be breaking down this month. But even if you look at this one over here, it only took 6 months. This second one took 17. So I don't know how long it's going to take, assuming that it eventually breaks down. But I do think that so far it's not really that much longer. If you measure it from the first peak, it took 25 months for it to break the range lows. From that first peak, we're currently at around 26 months. So at this point, we're still in the window of how long we might expect it to ultimately take. If you were to look at the 20-month SMA of the ETH Bitcoin valuation, the 20-month moving average, after it broke durably below it over here in July 2018, it took 2 years for it to break back above. And note that we had a fake out right there, just like we had a fake out right here. And so from breaking below it, we're currently only 13 months in. I'm saying it might take 2 years for ETH Bitcoin to durably break above the 20-month moving average. The 20-month SMA is currently at 0.065. So just something to think about, right? I mean, these trends can take a very long time to play out. And if you think about, how does ETH Bitcoin actually break down? Well, there's two different ways, right? It breaks down on a Bitcoin rally, or Bitcoin could go sideways, or it could break down on a Bitcoin dump. There's all sorts of different ways that it could break down. If you haven't seen alts break down against Bitcoin when Bitcoin's not doing anything or going down, just go back and look at May of 2022 when ETH Bitcoin was dropping like a rock, and so too was Bitcoin USD. So there are examples where alt Bitcoin pairs drop even as Bitcoin USD is dropping. And we've seen it in other sectors as well. I mean, I did a whole video on this recently that I'm sure no one watched, but if you look at the Rivian Tesla valuation, look at this. Look at where Rivian's Tesla valuation just fell back into. It's the same principle as alt Bitcoin pairs. It just fell back into the range low from summer of 2023. Right? Just fell back into the range low. Look at this. The low was 0.0527. This low right here, 0.0525. It's the same thing, right? I mean, the same principle of Bitcoin dominance can be applied to all these asset classes. Like, alt EV companies compared to the blue chip Tesla, right? Or the Russell compared to the NASDAQ, or the Russell compared to the S&P 500. You can take the same principles and apply it across asset classes. So this is an example here where alt EV companies bled against the blue chip EV company, even though the blue chip EV company wasn't really moving. Tesla hasn't really moved in a while. What happened? Well, the earnings for Rivian and Lucid came out, and they were not that great, right? They really were not that impressive, and so the market sold off. Now, again, altcoins don't have earnings calls, right? They don't have earnings reports. And what would they say if they did? Hey, we only rugged half our users this month, but we got a strong community going for us, and that's nice, and we'll rely on that. Oh, hey, we found another influencer to show the altcoins to their following. Yeah, we know they did the same thing last month and they rugged everyone, but hey, this time is different. It's the same thing over and over again, right? It's the same exact thing over and over again. And the alts sort of bleed against the blue chips, and the blue chips take back more and more of that market share. So there's examples where, you know, the blue chips don't have to do anything, and alts of that in that sector can then bleed against that blue chip, right? Here's a great example. Rivian Tesla. Lucid Tesla. Same thing, right? I mean, it already broke the range lows from summer of 2023. And the funny thing is you can find the same thing in crypto, right? Look at this. Look how the Lucid Tesla valuation, June 2023, it already broke down below it. You think, oh, well, that's EVs. Guys, the same thing's going on in crypto. Some of these alts have already broken down below their June 2023 lows. Look at Aave Bitcoin, right? Look at Aave Bitcoin. June 2023 low right there. It already actually wicked below it, right? It already wicked below it. So some of these alts have been weaker because they've already broken those range lows, right? In the same way that like the Rivian Tesla valuation is back to the summer 2023 low, Aave Bitcoin is back to the summer 2023 low. Some of them are not, right? Like ADA Bitcoin has not yet gone back to the summer 2023 low, right? It hasn't, but it probably will eventually. And I mean, if you look at like the ADA Bitcoin valuation, it's trying to hold on to its bull market support band, but I don't think it's going to be able to hold it. And if you look at like the ADA ETH valuation, you can see that it already fell below, right? It already fell below. And I was very clear back over here when ADA ETH capitulated that it would likely get some type of mean reversion back up to the midpoint of the channel. And it did, right? It did. The problem is now I think it's right here where it's bleeding back down to the bottom part of the channel. And by the way, this was May, June of 2019, which again occurred just before the Fed lowered rates, right? I mean, it was after the Fed paused and just before the Fed lowered rates, ADA ETH was sort of bleeding back down to the bottom part of this range. So I think the same thing is happening. I mean, I think a lot of this liquidity is just flowing back to Bitcoin. So, you know, you have different examples, right? One example is where Bitcoin doesn't do anything and alts bleed against it. The other example is where Bitcoin USD goes up and alts bleed against it because they just cannot keep pace with Bitcoin, right? They just cannot keep pace with it. And remember, previously, the previous times where ETH Bitcoin broke down, if you look at the prior examples where ETH Bitcoin broke down, it was on Bitcoin rallies, right? It was on Bitcoin rallies in these prior examples. So let's take a look, right? In this case right here, ETH Bitcoin broke down on a Bitcoin rally. In this case right here, ETH Bitcoin broke down on a Bitcoin rally. I don't know how long it's going to take, but at some point, I think it's going to break down. Could be on a Bitcoin rally. And I have no idea how high Bitcoin is going to have to go to ultimately break it down. If you look at some of these, you know, some of the larger trends here, what would it take for it to break down, right? Well, we could pull up Wolfram Alpha at current ETH valuation. What would it take, right? So like look at ETH.D. ETH.D is currently at 3160. Let's just say 3200, right? Let's just say 3200. So at what valuation would it ultimately take? It's got to go below 0.049, right? Below 0.049. At the current valuation, that would correspond to 65K Bitcoin. At 3,000, it would correspond to 61K. At 3,300, it would correspond to 67K. At 2,700, it would correspond to 55K. But in all of these cases, right, in all these cases, I mean, you can see what would have to happen. Now, if you look closely at what ETH Bitcoin did in the last cycle, it did not actually top. ETH Bitcoin did not break the range low on Bitcoin's top, is what I'm trying to say, right? So if you look at 2019, when Bitcoin finally topped, that's not where ETH Bitcoin broke the range low. ETH Bitcoin broke the range low 2 weeks later. So essentially, if you overlay it, ETH Bitcoin, if this is, you know, this is the range low right here, right? It did it a couple weeks later. It didn't do it on this first move. In the first move, it just got ETH Bitcoin back near the range low, but it didn't actually break it down, right? And the range low, you know, is around, let's just say, what is it? What would it be, like 0.052? So let's say ETH USD is at 3,300. Where would Bitcoin USD have to be to get back to a valuation of 0.052? It would have to be at around 63 to 64K. But you could get a scenario where then Bitcoin cools off for a week, gets another rally, puts in a lower high, and then from that level, ETH Bitcoin breaks down on a lower high from Bitcoin USD. That's what at least happened last cycle, right? So I still think that that's ultimately what's happening, is that you're getting this Bitcoin rally long enough to break alt Bitcoin pairs down. And, going into this year, I said my base case is that Bitcoin USD stays risk on until we're at 56% dominance. Now, you might wonder, why is 56% dominance important? And that goes back to the whole idea of this fib retracement idea that we saw from the prior cycle. Remember, if you take the fib retracement tool from the peak all the way down, Bitcoin USD topped out when dominance crossed the 0.5 fib retracement. Look at it like this. Right there. There it goes. Change that, right? So as Bitcoin dominance crossed the 0.5 fib retracement, that is where Bitcoin USD topped. Right there. Right? So then you look at it today and we say, well, where is it, right? From that top, that 0.5 fib retracement is at around 56%. So if it plays out like last cycle, it means risk on until Bitcoin dominance reaches 56%. So another 3% higher than where we currently are. Again, I can't know how high Bitcoin will go, or how high it has to go in order for Bitcoin to break these altcoins off of their support levels. It's impossible to know what that price corresponds to. And I've said before, it's foolish to try to predict exactly where it's going to top out. When we get into these mania phases, it's best to just get out of the way and say, hey, I don't know how high it's going to go. But what I think is that it's going to go high enough to break alt Bitcoin pairs down. If you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you can see what I'm talking about. During this 2019 rally before rate cuts arrived, alt Bitcoin pairs bled back down to the range lows, right? And so, if this wick right here is similar to that wick right there, then I think it's just a matter of time before alt Bitcoin pairs bleed back down and ultimately break below that. The reason why this is important is because where alt Bitcoin pairs broke down is precisely where Bitcoin USD topped, right? Again, overlaying Bitcoin USD onto this chart, Bitcoin USD topped precisely where alt Bitcoin pairs collapsed, below the range low, right? You see that? As these altcoins finally dropped, Bitcoin topped the week of June 24th right here. The reason it's not showing it, it's because it was a wick, but that's where it topped. That's exactly where alt Bitcoin pairs fell below their support. In that cycle, it was at 42%. That's where alt Bitcoin pairs fell below support. Bitcoin USD sucked that liquidity in from the altcoin market, took them collectively below their Bitcoin support levels. Bitcoin rolled over. Altcoins had nowhere to hide. So look at it the same thing, right? The same thing is likely happening here. These alts, I think, will eventually make their way back down to the June 2023 low, just like the Rivian Tesla valuation did, right? Aave Bitcoin is already back down to the June 2023 low. A lot of these altcoins are already making their way there, one altcoin at a time. It's just that a lot of people will just focus on the few that are outperforming and they'll ignore the larger trend. What I like to do is look at the larger trend and ignore the few that are the exceptions to the rule, right? These theories are not based on, the 10 different micro caps that were created last week, right? It's based on the larger market cap altcoins that have been around forever. So I think that this is ultimately the next outcome, is for alt Bitcoin pairs to bleed back down to the range lows. And then from there, I think they finally go down. So when you ask me, where does Bitcoin USD top out? My response has been for a long time, right? A long time, that it tops out likely when alt Bitcoin pairs break off support, right? What is support? 40%, right? We're at 0.44. If you see a weekly close of total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin below 40, below 0.4, so if you see it at 0.39, that means alt Bitcoin pairs have collectively broken down. And you can see on individual Bitcoin charts, they're already getting close to breaking down. I mean, even going back to Matic Bitcoin from before, right? Like, I mean, it's in dangerous territory right here. I don't know if it's going to break down immediately or not, but you can imagine that if there is a strong enough Bitcoin move, it could break Matic off of this Bitcoin support level, so that if it's down here and then Bitcoin gets some type of correction, well, Matic Bitcoin already broke support and therefore it continues to go down. You could also look at total 2 minus USDT Bitcoin and take the same type of approach and say, well, it's likely going to break down below this level. That would correspond to about 0.72. So if you see it at 0.7, you know, maybe even let's just say 0.69, because this wick right there went all the way down to 0.7. If you see this at 0.69, it's an indication that it's starting to break down. And remember, last cycle, when it ultimately broke down, that's what marked the top for Bitcoin USD. I think people are frustrated that I won't just give them a number, but I don't know. Like, I don't know how high it has to go to break altcoins down, because one of the issues is that Bitcoin goes higher, it drags the altcoin market with it. It's just that Bitcoin has gone up more, and that's why the Bitcoin dominance continues to go up, right? That's why the Bitcoin dominance is at 53%, is because, yes, the altcoin market is going up with Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is outperforming the altcoin market. So if you want exposure to crypto, you could just stick with Bitcoin because it gives you exposure to the upside while minimizing your downside risk. So when I think about where do alt Bitcoin pairs ultimately have to go, I think they have to break support durably. And that means total 3 minutes USDT to Bitcoin breaking below this level here, 0.4, which will likely happen. And if you look at blue chip dominance, right? If you look at like Bitcoin plus Ethereum dominance, because I know a lot of you guys are ETH maxis, and again, I am long term. I don't think that ETH Bitcoin will bleed forever, but I do think it is bleeding. But if you look at the Bitcoin dominance plus the ETH dominance, where did Bitcoin top out last cycle? It was after they broke through these range highs. So at 73%, right? That was where ultimately it happened. And so we're about 72% now, and we've seen this wick up here to 73%. So what if Bitcoin USD just tops out after the blue chip dominance is at 73%? Now you might say, well, hold on a second. You said Bitcoin could stay risk on until 56% dominance. Well, how can that be if then this one only needs to go up 1%? Well, remember, you could have a scenario where the dominance of Bitcoin goes up from 53 to 56, but the Ethereum dominance is going down during that time, so that the blue chip dominance still goes up, but it's not going up as much as the Bitcoin dominance is, because the Ethereum dominance, which is included in the blue chip dominance, is going down. Same thing happened over there, right? When Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance broke through in June of 2019, it was actually during a period where ETH dominance was going down, right? ETH dominance had this, had a bit of a surge over here, but ultimately it broke down as Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, so blue chip dominance, broke up. So there's a lot of different metrics that say, look, when alt Bitcoin pairs break down, that's where Bitcoin USD likely puts in a local top, right? When ETH Bitcoin durably goes below 0.049, that's likely where Bitcoin USD puts in a local top. When USDT dominance revisits the trend line, perhaps that is where Bitcoin USD puts in a local top, right? This trend line right here. You'll remember all these examples, right? This was November of 2021. This was March of 2021. This was just before the pandemic crash. This was right when interest rates started to get cut in the summer of 2019. That's where we hit that trend line in Bitcoin USD top. Same thing over here, January 2018. That's where Bitcoin USD, or December 2017, that's where Bitcoin USD topped. I put out a long video a few weeks ago about USDT dominance, saying it could likely get rejected here at 6.5% and make its way back down as Bitcoin rallies into the halving and breaks alt Bitcoin pairs down. And so far, that's what's happening. I mean, it's breaking back down. And this trend line, the USDT dominance, slowly, this trend line from where it hits, right, it slowly is climbing up. Again, if you see this at 4%, that could be a warning sign, just like it was a warning sign over here where there had to be some form of massive rotation in the Cryptoverse where people go away from the riskier stuff as we go into a risk-off period for a while. So I think that that's another potential signal for a local top on Bitcoin USD. But the issue is that none of these have been hit yet, right? None of them. ETH Bitcoin still not below 0.049. Alt Bitcoin pairs still haven't broken down. USDT dominance still not at 4%. The issue is that, that means, yes, I think there will come a time in the not so distant future where Bitcoin USD puts in a significant local top for many, many months. But I still want to see those other things break down first, right? I still want to see ETH Bitcoin go back below 0.049. I want to see alt Bitcoin pairs below 0.4. I want to see all of that. And for the people that say, well, why don't we include USDT dominance into this? Because that's important. Well, if you do that, you see a very similar pattern as well, where Bitcoin dominance did not top until the Bitcoin plus ETH plus USDT dominance hit 82%, right? We know that Bitcoin dominance topped in September 2019 when the Fed pivoted, and the Bitcoin plus ETH plus USDT dominance was at 82%. Right now, it's at 76%. This move to the upper part of the range, that hasn't happened yet, right? It hasn't happened. And so if this metric reaches 82%, then I might be willing to say, all right, the dominance rally, that could be it. But that hasn't happened yet. It just hasn't. And everyone keeps trying to rush it and say that, all right, the dominance rally, they think the dominance rally is over. You give it enough time, it just keeps on going up. And, we can look for all sorts of technical reasons why it won't. But from a fundamental perspective, people say, I don't do fundamental analysis. Well, it is fundamental analysis. Basically saying, look, until the Fed pivots, the altcoins that, that were minted last week, where they're just trying to make the founders rich, right? They're going to bleed back to Bitcoin because they're riskier. They're riskier. And inevitably, there's some people in the chat that'll say, well, what about this altcoin that's outperforming? Yes, congratulations. I'm not referring to that altcoin. I'm referring to the collective altcoin market, not the altcoin you bought last month because it was showed on Reddit. So please be understanding that the blue chip dominance, or even in this case, Bitcoin plus ETH plus USDT dominance, right? What if it's just an oscillator where during economic slowdowns, we go up to 82%, or during parabolic rallies by Bitcoin, right? Either case, parabolic rallies by Bitcoin or parabolic rallies by Bitcoin where you're going into or shifting from QT to QE, right? 82% is ultimately where it went, if not a little bit higher. It's currently at 76% right now. It implies it could go up, right? It implies it would go higher. What if it's an oscillator? By the way, most altcoins over a long enough period of time just bleed against Bitcoin. This is the alt Bitcoin chart, right? These are alt Bitcoin chart. And I don't know what you guys make of this, but what do I see? I see lower highs and lower lows. That's what I see. I don't know what you see, but apparently what I see is different than what a lot of people see when it comes to altcoins. But alt Bitcoin pairs over here topped out at 1.35. Here, they topped out at 1 or so. This low was 0.25. This low right here was 0.2. Over a long enough period of time, alt Bitcoin pairs bleed. Even the people that, there's some altcoins people point to and say, well, look at that one. Look how, XRP is a great example, right? XRP is one of these it's kind of like Litecoin in the sense that it didn't put in a new high really this or at least a durable high. XRP topped out at $2. There's a lot of people that have been bullish on XRP since forever, right? They've been bullish on it since 2017. We're now 7 years later and it still hasn't taken out the highs. 7 years later. 7 years later, those people could have just stuck with Bitcoin instead of XRP, preserved the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio, but instead, no. They said Bitcoin was bad old tech no one cared about anymore, and that XRP would reclaim all that market share. Couldn't put in a new high. You tell me. If you look at the XRP Bitcoin valuation, look at it. It hasn't gone up to the range highs since 2018, right? Since 2018. Yeah, maybe it'll come back down here and bounce, right? That's probably the most likely outcome. But this is the point, is that it hasn't gained on Bitcoin durably since 2018. And I can't tell you how many people out there, all these XRP people, that love to dunk on Bitcoin dominance. But you want to see a funny chart? Why don't we look at XRP dominance? Look at XRP dominance. Look at what it's done since 2017. If you go to a price label, right? 32% over there. Think about how high that was, 32%, 18%, 13%, 6%, 4%. Now it's at 1.5%. So you know all the people that like to dunk on Bitcoin dominance because they say, oh, well, there's all these new altcoins coming in. They're not accounting for the stablecoin market, right? What about XRP dominance? What is it doing? At least Bitcoin dominance is going up, right? So yes, you can point to stablecoins and say dominance will never go back to 60% if you want, which is what a lot of people do. Look at Bitcoin dominance. But at least it's been going up, right? It's been going higher. You can't say the same thing about XRP dominance. I mean, in July, it was at 4%. Now it's at 1.5% dominance. So you see the issue is that no matter what happens, people are going to point to a random new altcoin that's going up against Bitcoin over a short period of time, but then you zoom out and you're like, well, it's just been bleeding against Bitcoin forever. The dominance of that altcoin has been going down for a long time. So how do you preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio? You keep your portfolio Bitcoin heavy, because the expectation is that over a long enough period of time, a lot of these altcoins will just eventually bleed back to Bitcoin. Sometimes they'll go up against Bitcoin for 1 or 2 cycles, but then eventually they just bleed back to it. So if you are speculating in the altcoin market, be aware that they will likely not go up against Bitcoin forever. Eventually they will likely bleed back to the king. Again, XRP, a coin, by the way, that I made some money on back in 2017, and I have nothing personal against it. And there exists a future scenario where I might think it could go up again, right? Against Bitcoin. Maybe not durably, but maybe over a certain period of time. But the problem is that the people that dunk on Bitcoin dominance and that talk about how great XRP is, why don't you ask them to pull up the XRP dominance chart and have them explain to you why it has just been going down since 2018? Despite all the VC money that came in last cycle, despite all of it, dominance of Bitcoin did not take out the low from the last cycle. So for everyone out there that likes to say your views on Bitcoin dominance are wrong, the space is different now than it ever was back then, I would retort, well, if that's the case, why did dominance not go lower than it was in 2017? Which, by the way, also now includes a lot of stablecoins. The stablecoin market cap over here was a lot higher than it was over here. Even despite all the stablecoins, Bitcoin dominance still could not put in a lower low. So, if we're being honest with ourselves, how can you explain that? How can we explain why was dominance not able to put in a lower low despite the fact that stablecoin market cap made up like 5 to 10% of the market cap? Meaning it would have been a lot easier for dominance to put in a lower low compared to 2018. They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. So it's hard for me to really get on board with the altcoin narrative stuff about how the dominance views are wrong when dominance couldn't even put it a lower low. It couldn't. And again, if you were to overlay like USDT dominance onto this chart, look at this. USDT dominance over here was much greater. It was like 6% or so. It even went all the way up to like 8% in June 2022 going into the merge rally by ETH Bitcoin. Back over here, USDT dominance was at like 0.4%. So despite the fact that despite the fact that stablecoins made up a much larger market cap of the overall market and made up a much larger dominance, despite all of that, Bitcoin dominance still did not put any lower low. So my target has been 60% on Bitcoin dominance. That's where I ultimately think it's going. Could go higher, right? It could go higher, but I think 60% is a likely outcome over a long enough period of time. I think that a lot of people are just very impatient And because dominance has taken a long time to rally, they assume it's not happening, but it is happening. It's just taking place over a long period of time. What I'm afraid might happen is, how like ETH Bitcoin rallied up to between the 786 and the 1 fib retracement level, and then every step of the way, like literally every single lower high, I had to deal with people saying, oh, just wait, it's still going to flip ETH, or ETH's still going to flip Bitcoin. It still just kept on bleeding, right? It still just kept on bleeding as more and more people finally threw in the towel and said, all right, yeah, it's going down, right? And then when it finally got back to the range lows, it finally got a larger bounce back up to the upside. But the problem is that no one believed this, or maybe not no one. There are certainly people that did, but so many people refused to believe that this was actually happening. So what happens if Bitcoin USD ends up doing something similar, right? Where it gets that retracement. It's not even that far away from the 786 now, right? It's not even that far away. But what happens if it gets that retracement into this range, breaks alt Bitcoin pairs down, right, in that range, breaks alt Bitcoin pairs down to alt Bitcoin pairs below 0.4, ETH Bitcoin below 0.049, and then as it comes back down, no one believes, right? No one believes that could possibly be a local high for a while. But then it just sort of bleeds back down for a while because this entire move got front ran because all this liquidity was in the altcoin market and it made its way over to Bitcoin. And then you get an example like this, right, where then Bitcoin USD, after it tops out, after ETH Bitcoin breaks down and after alt Bitcoin pairs break down, it then gets a final, it finally gets that 50% correction that so many people would like to have, right? This, finally got that 50% drop. But that 50% drop by Bitcoin, guess when it happened? After ETH Bitcoin broke down. After alt Bitcoin pairs broke down. This is a pretty significant level over here at 30K. And a lot of people like to compare it to 2015 and 2016 and say, look, it's likely going to retest that level at some point. And I think it probably will, to be completely honest, because a lot of these eventually retest it, right? You can see that they ultimately come back down and retest it. But I mean, in the same way over here, right? Look at last cycle with Bitcoin. Do you see that level there where it sort of fell back into? After that 2019 rally into rate cuts, it fell back down into that level. Same thing, right? Look at that. You see that same level, right? So this level here is like that level right there. And then it had this massive rally above that level, right? So it rallied about 112% above it. Right here, we're about 75% above it, right? We're not that far away from being 112% above. I don't know if it's going to go that high or not, but even in that case, it's still, after all that, it still faded back down to retest that level eventually, right? My guess is that it will likely retest that level, and if it's a soft landing, it might hold that level. If it's a hard landing, then it takes that level out and comes down into here. That's possible, right? It's possible that could happen. But last cycle, right, we did not see Bitcoin top out until ETH Bitcoin broke down. And we're still waiting. Like, the jury's still out on how long that's going to take. So for the people that keep asking me, well, how high is Bitcoin going to go? I don't know. I think it needs to go high enough to break alt Bitcoin pairs down. I think it needs to go high enough to individually break these alt Bitcoin pairs down. ADA Bitcoin likely needs to go back down to 800 sats and likely go below it. Matic Bitcoin likely needs to go below 1700 sats. AVAX Bitcoin likely going to go back down. A lot of people say, well, this is a pretty impressive move here by AVAX Bitcoin. Will it come back down? I don't know. Look at Dash Bitcoin from the last cycle. Very similar move. Look at this. Look at the move by Dash Bitcoin from the last cycle. You see how there was this low here before that final rally, and then it came back into that low and had a massive rally. It still eventually just faded back down, right? AVAX Bitcoin, is it doing the same thing, right? Massive rally off that low, slowly fading back down. Dash Bitcoin, after it had that massive rally, it then came back down to the 20-week SMA, got a final bounce back up, and then bled back down. AVAX Bitcoin, guess where it is right now? At the 20-week SMA, right? So inevitably, if it bounces sometime in the next few weeks, remember, A lot of these altcoins are the same exact thing. I have nothing wrong with AVAX. Honestly, I hope it survives, right? I hope it does. I hope a lot of these projects survive. It's just a recognition that this is what happens in the cryptoverse. Alts bleed to Bitcoin, whether you like it or not. That has been the trend over a long period of time. ETH Bitcoin, for everyone that tells me it's been putting in higher lows forever, I agree with you. I'm on your side in that. It has been putting in higher lows forever, and that's why I'm potentially interested in it eventually. But it's also been putting in lower highs since 2017. So how do you reconcile that? You know, at what point do we say, hey, it's been a decade and it still hasn't taken out the prior high, right? 3 years from now, right? 3 years from now, it'll be 2027. If ETH Bitcoin has not taken out the 2017 high, what do we say? You're talking about 10 years of your life. A decade later, you know, if you're 20, you're now 30. If you were 30 back then, you're now 40, right? A decade later, and it still potentially hasn't taken out the high. Do we just keep pointing to the higher lows? Or do we point to the lower highs? My guess is that it's ultimately converging into whatever the fair value is. I don't think ETH Bitcoin in any reasonable time frame is taking out 0.15, a 3x move from the current levels. I just don't. I don't. I think that that's been pretty clear for a long time. I don't think Ethereum is going to flip Bitcoin in anytime soon. Probably not ever, but I don't know. I don't want to say that. It's hard to know what's going to happen a decade from now. But it just hasn't. You know, it just hasn't. And if you look at the ETH Bitcoin trend here, one of the things you may notice is that, and I'm not really sure how to sort of draw this out, but you can see that this is kind of, you know, this was sort of a level here where it held it here too, finally broke down, back tested it, and then just back tested it again. A lot of these coins are doing that same exact thing on shorter time frames. Like look at ADA Bitcoin on a daily time frame. It did the same thing, right? Look at this. You have a low, you have a higher low, you have a higher low here as well. You finally break down below it, you back test it, and then you back test it again. There's just so much liquidity, right? There's so much liquidity that's getting absorbed. Look at it like this. You guys remember, look at alt Bitcoin monthly candles. Right? It's the same thing. I mean, it's the same thing, right? You get your first move down right here, right? I'm not really sure why the straw thing is not working. Let me see if I can get this to work. So you get your initial move down right there, then your secondary move down, and then the third one, right? This is your first one right here. You get a little bounce, right? You get your first move down and then a bounce and then down. First move down and then a bounce and then down. Consolidate in this range, and then eventually it breaks down, right? So that's what I ultimately think is going to happen, is that alt Bitcoin pairs will eventually break down. When they do, that likely marks the Bitcoin USD top for at least a while, right? Before a larger correction. I'm not saying it has to go back down, you know, to a lower low, but it could certainly mark at least a 50% drop from that level when they break down. I think that would be sort of a turning point in the cryptoverse, kind of an acknowledgement that, all right, a lot of liquidity has now bled back to Bitcoin. Is there still enough liquidity to keep it going higher, or does it, you know, does it fade? And the issue again is that last cycle dominance didn't top until the Fed pivoted, and we're still not at a Fed pivot, right? So if there's no pivot in March or the May meeting, I'll still be bullish on Bitcoin dominance. If there's a pivot in July, then I might pivot, right? What if dominance just rallies until September, which is exactly what it did in 2019? Maybe it just rallies until September, finally tops out at 60%, and then turns around. Maybe that's what happens, right? I don't know, but a lot of different things to consider when it comes to, you know, to Bitcoin dominance and how it historically has played out. So I hope these Bitcoin dominance views are useful to you guys. I know that they typically just elicit a lot of hate and whatnot. And I get it. The reason I get it is because I was that person in prior cycles. Like I was that person that thought there's no way this altcoin will ever go down against Bitcoin. I was that person, so I get it, right? I get why that emotion exists. I was that person. Now I'm trying to say, hey guys, alts have been bleeding against Bitcoin for years, and people don't want to believe it. And what am I to do, right? What am I to do? They cherry pick some of the altcoins that outperform Bitcoin to say you're wrong. I always said there was going to be some. I always said there's going to be some that do it, but the general trend is down. And that's the issue, is that, you know, there hasn't really been a durable change in the alt Bitcoin pairs at this point. So just something to think about as it relates to Bitcoin. The other thing is gold. If you look at last cycle, that is ultimately what marked the risk off time as well. You know, you can see these range highs right here. Gold broke through that in June of, you know, July of 2019. That's what marked the Bitcoin local top. So I've said before, if you see gold trading above 2070 durably, that could be a risk-off signal. When you see ETH Bitcoin durably below 0.049, that's a risk-off signal, or alt Bitcoin pairs below 0.4, that's a risk-off signal. Hasn't happened yet. Bitcoin keeps climbing the wall of worry. The other thing to consider too is if you look at the fear and greed index into 2019, what happened was there was these higher highs, and then finally it rallied all the way up to a fear and greed level of 95, and then that marked the final high for that year. And so, you know, right now it's still in the 70s, but we did get pretty close when we got to 79 and 78 just a few days ago. So if you see the fear and greed index in the 90s, like imagine this. Imagine sometime in the next few months, the fear and greed index hits 95 or the 80s, and you're looking at ETH Bitcoin and it's below 0.049. You're looking at alt Bitcoin pairs below 0.4. You're looking at gold above 270. You're like, well, hell, this is the same thing as last cycle. That might be something to consider. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I did not cover. We got Bitcoin down. Oh, maybe just a brief moment on this. This is Bitcoin dominance excluding stables, an approximation of it in TradingView, right? So if you don't have access to ITC Premium, which has it, you don't need it, right? You don't need access to it to have excluding stablecoins, right? Go over to TradingView. Here's the formula for it, right? Here's the formula. This is the formula right here. I mean, you can see it right here. It's on the screen, right? By the way, you have to type in like crypto cap for some of these, right? So if you just type in, I don't know if it's still true, but if you just type in USDC, like it comes up with some, you know, this, right? You don't want that, right? So when you're typing in something, you have to do like crypto cap USDC, and that will get you the market cap of it. But if you just type in like USDC, you get this. And who the hell knows what that is? So the issue is if you're doing USDT dominance, or if you're doing like USDT market cap plus USDC market cap like that, you'll get a chart that looks like this. The problem is that I don't know if that USD, let's just check. Let me just check on the fly. So that's 97.97. Now come in here and let's put in crypto cap. Sorry, I must have misspelled it. R. Yeah, there you have it, 126. So a lot of people make that mistake of just doing like USDT plus USDC plus DAI. But the issue is that some of these tickers like USDC, if you don't specify it's in the crypto space, it'll return something different. I can't tell you how many people I've seen do that, and I'm just kind of like yelling at my screen, being like, you're not actually measuring USDT market cap or USDC market cap. You have to put in crypto cap USDC to actually see that. So be careful when you do that. If you're not careful, you will be looking at something different than what you think you're looking at. So something important to remember. The other thing, I'm glad I did not end the video because I really wanted to make sure I went over this. The social risk. If you go look at like YouTube views and stuff, you know, there have been some upticks here and there, but there's no clear indication that retail is back. And until retail comes back, dominance goes higher, right? If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, go look at, here's the social risk. Right? Social risk. kind of doing what it did in 2019, in fact, right? I mean, like, it's not that different. I mean, it really does look really similar how social risk went up, and then it just sort of came back down. And I think it's possibly doing something similar. And even you might say, well, Bitcoin USD is going higher. Yeah, I mean, even after social risk topped over here, Bitcoin was only at like 7,000. It still went up another, 80% or something from there before it topped out. And you can see here, Bitcoin or social risk at least found this local high back at 42K. And now Bitcoin USD is at like 54K, right? So yeah, I mean, it's still doing what it did last cycle. The problem is that, a lot of people, I think, assume that, that there's a lot of retail just waiting to come back. And I'm not saying that retail won't come back. I think they eventually will. But I think we need to get to a Fed pivot first. We need looser monetary policy before retail is going to come back and take the dominance of Bitcoin down. The people that are coming back now and buying, I mean, there's institutions, and yes, there's some new people. But if retail were coming back in mass, dominance would be going down. But it's not, right? It's not. And here's the dominance excluding stablecoins, right? I mean, you can kind of see that it's been putting in these higher lows. It has had some wicks down, right? But it's still technically putting in higher lows here, right? You could argue that this is still on the general trend of higher lows for a long period of time. So the social risk, right? The social risk is still pretty low. And I think in order to see the dominance go down, you need to see the social risk go up. So if you look at it like this, right? So if we go look at the workbench, let's pull up Bitcoin dominance. I don't really care about without. Yeah, let's do without stablecoins. And we're going to add on the social risk here. So do you see where dominance cratered? It was when social risk went crazy. Social risk hasn't done that yet, and a lot of times it doesn't do it until well after Bitcoin's making new highs and also after a Fed pivot. So as long as social risk is down in the dumps down here, Bitcoin dominance generally trends higher, right? And so over here, after the social risk finally bottomed, it still stayed relatively subdued for a long time, and it only recently bottomed in like September, October of 2023. So just something to keep in mind. As social risk stays low, Bitcoin dominance goes up. And the reason is because, there's only one main king. There's only one king in the Cryptoverse, is Bitcoin. So majority of people are going to at least know what Bitcoin is. They're going to have some in their portfolio. There's tens of thousands of different altcoins. So it's hard to keep those bids sustained against Bitcoin if everyone's getting pulled to different newer and newer altcoins every single week. And also, I think there is a risk too with the idea that the social risk will go back up to save your altcoins. And the main risk there is that, well, if the Fed does stay too high for too long and they lead us into a recession, then you might not see the social risk go back up in the short term, right? It could still take a year or two before you see the social risk go up in a material fashion. And if that's the case, it means that the Bitcoin dominance doesn't go down in a material fashion, right? If something like that were to happen. And again, I know that it's sort of this like, oh, don't talk about that stuff because we've heard it before. But again, when it comes to the Macroverse and whatnot, the thing that I've said forever is that it's upon the uninversion of the treasury yield spreads that it becomes an issue where the economy might be slowing down. We haven't had that yet. And again, it's one of those things where I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's normally upon the uninversion. Sometimes it can be during the uninversion process before it's uninverted, but usually it's after the uninversion where the economy really starts to slow down. We haven't had that yet. And so it kind of goes back to all these ideas of we haven't seen ETH Bitcoin break down. We haven't seen alt Bitcoin pairs break down. We haven't seen the uninversion of the yield curve. We haven't seen blue chip dominance break above 73%. We haven't seen gold break above 2070. If all those things happen, that's your risk off signal. Until then, we've climbed the wall of worry. So those are my views. And I think that, this inverted yield curve stuff and the economy, that's sort of the biggest risk to the idea that retail is coming anytime soon to save your altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs. And there's still a risk that the dominance of Bitcoin just keeps on going higher because we are further away from a Fed pivot than a lot of people think we are. And if the dominance keeps on going up, then I mean, all Bitcoin pairs continue to bleed, right? That's just the most likely outcome. So again, I know it's not a popular view. I know that if I made a single video talking about, altcoins in a bullish light against Bitcoin, I would get a lot more likes. I would get a lot more views because I see the people that do it. I see the people that are bearish on dominance, and they have been for 2 years. I see those people, they get a lot more views and likes than I do. But they're wrong, right? They've been wrong for 2 years, and their viewers don't want to believe it. The reason they don't want to believe it is because they want their altcoins to go up so they can dump those altcoins on these theoretical retail participants that are going to eventually come. The biggest risk to that is that retail doesn't come back in the next few months. Maybe retail doesn't come back until 2025, right? Or even later, right? I don't know. But at this point, retail has not yet returned. And you can see it. I mean, like look at like, followers to various Twitter and analysts, right? I mean, like we're nowhere near what we saw in 2021, right? Nowhere near it. Nowhere close. Look at exchanges, Twitter followers to exchanges. We've seen a little bit of uptick recently. Nowhere near what we saw in 2021. How do you get back to that, right? How do you get back to that? Look at 2019, right? Look at 2019. We had some rallies in here by Bitcoin USD that also led to new followers to exchanges, but eventually it just faded back down because we still had not gotten onto the other side of a Fed pivot. So I think the issue is that, a lot of people think that the dominance is about to crater because the Fed's about to pivot, but inflation is still sky high. I mean, again, the Fed can't really pivot if headline, I mean, I know they don't really look at headline as much as they do as, say, core PCE, but headline inflation is still holding strong at 3%. Core inflation is still not durably necessarily going back to their 2% target. I mean, it's kind of stalled out here at around that 4% threshold. So until that actually happens, the Fed can't really pivot. And if the Fed can't pivot, it means QT's here longer. It means higher rates are here for longer. Higher for longer, as they have said. I said 2 years ago that the Fed would likely, the terminal rate would likely be 5.5%. No one believed it, right? They said, no, 3.5%. No going higher than that. And here we are at 5.5%, and the dominance well above that level they said would never be broken, 49%. We're now at 53% dominance. So inflation still high, Fed can't pivot, dominance likely going up. The main issue for retail participants is that the Fed stays too high for too long, and they cause the economy to slow down to the point where people don't really come back to those altcoins in mass until later than people think they will. And I think that's why people keep front running the Bitcoin dominance theoretical dump, because they think dominance is going to dump, and then it just keeps on going higher. Because these nebulous retail market participants just aren't coming back, right? Bitcoin USD keeps going higher. And we talked a lot about how Bitcoin USD does this exact same thing, right? Like the last several videos, right? Up, consolidate, go higher, right? Up, consolidate, go higher. Up, consolidate, go up. Same thing, up, consolidate, go up. It's the same trend. By the time you get a larger pullback, 30% or so, once we finally get a larger pullback that's not just a 20% drawdown, once you finally get a 30% drop, it might imply that the actual 50% drop is coming, and then maybe we go all the way back down to to 30K or so. But at this point, I mean, that could certainly happen, after the halving. I've said many times that what it seems like is happening is we're just chasing narratives. It was the merge rally, it was the spot ETF rally, now it's the halving rally, right? Now it's the Bitcoin halving rally. And as we get closer to the halving, as I've said many, many times, that liquidity should flow back into Bitcoin. The Bitcoin dominance should go up. And if all Bitcoin pairs break off of their support levels, that is where Bitcoin USD might find a local top. Also, another risk is the long end of the yield curve is starting to look like it's... Look, my view on the long end of the yield curve is that back over here, I said that at the very least, we'll likely retest the 20-week SMA at 4.3%. Now we're there. If inflation still comes in hot the next few months, then you could see the long end of the yield curve go back up. And if the long end of the yield curve goes back up, you might get another correction in the S&P. This correction right here in the S&P was as the long end of the yield curve went up. If you look at the US 10-year, overlay it with stocks, right? As the 10-year went up, stocks finally dropped. Initially, while the 10-year went up, stocks went up with it. But as the 10-year continued to break, as it broke out, that's where stocks finally got a larger pullback. So if the 10-year does rally back up, that could be detrimental for stocks. But I mean, maybe it has to make a new high for it to be detrimental. I don't really know if the 10-year is going to go. So my view on the 10-year, back, if you're not familiar with my views that I've expressed many, many times on any time we get, FOMC stuff, my views on the 10-year over here was that that was a potential potential top at around 5%. And then I said, a lot of times when the 10-year tops, it then can revisit that level or put in a slightly lower high. So I think we all need to be aware that it could go back up to the range high at 5%. Worst case scenario, in this business cycle, you might see it go to where the short end is today. And the short end today is at 5.5%. Now imagine what that would do to the economy if the long end of the yield curve went to 5.5%. That would be a bear steepener, right? If the long end of the yield curve would, instead of a bull steepener, it'd be a bear steepener. I don't know if we're going to get that again, but it is possible, right? It is possible if inflation stays too sticky for too long, then eventually the yields are going to have to go up if they just sort of throw their hands up and say, well, the economy's too hot. The Fed can't pivot. So that is something that I think we have to be aware of too. And then the last thing is the dollar. The dollar, the last time the dollar made this strong move right here, Bitcoin dominance went up like 10 weeks in a row, right? It followed suit. The dollar's pulled back a little bit here, but I've said before that the dollar looks like it's following Bitcoin dominance, right? If you look at least just delayed by like a year or something. If you look at Bitcoin dominance overlaid onto this chart, it did a very similar thing, right? It's just that you had a low, a lower low, and a lower low, a high, a lower high, then a higher high, right? Same thing, dollar low, lower low, lower low, high, lower high, higher high. And then the Bitcoin dominance then came back in here to put in a higher low and then another higher low after getting rejected by the 20-week SMA. The dollar, a higher low, potential rejection by the 20-week SMA. I'd be looking for some form of a higher low, somewhere between 101 to 10, to where the current levels are, right? Somewhere in that level, I think dollar will get a bounce, and then it'll start to come back up here. And the reason why I think the dollar will get a bounce from those levels is because I think that other central banks around the world are going to pivot more aggressively than the Fed because they have weaker economies than the United States. If you think about it, in the same way that Bitcoin is the blue chip of the Cryptoverse, in the same way that Tesla is the blue chip of the EV stocks, in the same way that the Magnificent Seven are the blue chip of the main indices, right? The Nasdaq, the S&P 500. The U.S. economy is the blue chip of all these world economies, right? It is the one that is king, right? It's the one that has the highest GDP. It's the one that stays stronger for longer. It is the one which, if it shows weakness, then the Fed will pivot. And the issue is that these other economies are already rolling into a recession, right? I mean, some of them are already printing 2 quarters of negative GDP. And those central banks are going to likely have to pivot before the United States, before the Fed will pivot. And because of that, I think the dollar is bound to go back up. I think the biggest question is the next few weeks, how low does it go before it gets that bid? But once that bid comes, I think it will be pretty aggressive into the middle to end part of this year. And then finally, the Fed will be forced to pivot because they will have stayed too high for too long. And if the Fed is going higher for longer, or if they're staying higher for longer, then it means the Bitcoin dominance is staying higher for longer, right? And the Bitcoin dominance, major milestones, break 55%. If it gets to that 56% level, I would be on high alert on the Bitcoin USD chart. Alt Bitcoin pairs below 0.4, be on high alert. ETH Bitcoin below 0.049, be on high alert. Gold above 270, high alert, etc. We've gone on a long time. I got to wrap it up. Let's see if the dominance can make this rally. Let's see if it can get to 56%. If we get to 56% here in the next couple of months, then we'll have to do another video like this and check in to see where we are. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Links in the description below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.